Hey folks, Scott Weingart here, and this is the EMCrit podcast. So I just got back from one of the most enjoyable two-day courses that I've ever been to. It was Resus.to. It was a course about a lot of the soft skills like debriefing and simulation and how to integrate that. There was a lot of clinical stuff as well. It was absolutely fantastic. I got to teach for one day of this course and for the second day just be a pure student, and I learned a ton. I don't know when the next one is going to be, but whenever it is, you want to go to that course. So just Google Resus.to, and it immediately comes up, their website. Just contact them and say, I'd like to be contacted when the next one's happening because you will love it. Now, at that course, I gave a plenary lecture, and it was on this, critical airway mindset and management. And what it really was introducing is my most recent iteration of, my remix of the shock trauma failed airway algorithm. And it's really, I think, a departure in my previous thinking. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, in the course of that lecture, a friend of mine, a excellent foam personality, actually, the night before, the two of us, we were talking, and I told him that I think Twitter sucks, and he was defending Twitter. He's telling me, no, there's some good aspects of it, and I'm like, no, Twitter's a piece of steaming awful. And he's like, no, it's great. And then he did some fairly innocuous tweets of my lecture, and whoa, what a shitstorm, for reasons I don't fully understand, but people came out in full flagrant assholery, and it was even people who should know better kind of jumped the gun on this one, and I think, and I'm like, I know you're misinterpreting, and hopefully this lecture will clear this up for these people, but wow, Twitter's in really bad shape, and I'm going to do a whole on why Twitter sucks, and maybe I'll convince you. Maybe I'll convince you to stop using these particular services until they shape up, because right now they are designed to turn nice, normal people into real dicks. Okay, and this is just the kind of example of the kind of crap that came in. This is one of many. This is, most of these will come from anesthetists in the United Kingdom. It's a different game there than you're going to find in most of the other parts of the world. So, just feast your eyes on that one or this one. At least this is a little bit less flagrantly disturbing, but still sentiment. I feel for you UK EM folks and critical care folks. This seems like a hard situation. Now, the funny thing was I got accused of tribalism on Twitter. And, in the midst of those posts, they accused me of tribalism. But they're right. I am a tribalist. I am absolutely a tribalist. They just mistook who my tribe is. They seem to think my tribe is emergency medicine, and it certainly is not, as most people who have listened to the podcast know. I am a tribalist. I am a ardent and fervent tribalist, but my tribe is resuscitationists. And I think that's not actually a bad tribe to have because it is cross-platform, it is cross-disciplinary, it is cross-specialty. So I welcome everyone into the fond embrace of resuscitationism. If you like taking care of sick people and you do it well and you commit to it and you deliberately practice it and you make it your life's work, then hey, you're part of my tribe. And if you have a specialty name that is somewhat indicative in your own head that it lets you think you're skilled at taking care of sick people, but you don't do the right thing, then you are out of my tribe, and I will hate upon you and layer, high levels of opprobrium upon you. So there you go. I am a tribalist, but my tribe is resuscitationist, and it includes EM, critical care, anesthesia, GI, radiology, paramedicine, EMTism, whatever the frig you want, as long as you are committed to taking care of sick people. So accuse me of being a tribalist, but get damn right what tribe I am a member of. Okay, so here was the lecture without all of that editorial bullshit, and the lecture is We Suck at Airway, which actually, it was in Canada, so that was just me channeling the inner polite Canadian, because the real title is You suck at Airway. You do. You suck at Airway. Well, maybe you don't, but you probably do if you learn the way you were taught. And that's the key. Now, this is where we have to talk about the differences between anesthesia and then the other resuscitative specialties. And this is maybe like one of the only frank differences. And this is where a lot of the confusion came, because instead of actually asking me what the fuck I was talking about, they just went by a 2-word tweet with no explanation and decided to go off on a Twitter storm about it. Here's the thing about anesthesia. If you put in no real contemplation, no real deliberate practice, you just did your job during your years as an anesthesia resident or registrar, you would still come out the back end pretty damn good at laryngoscopy and airway management. I mean, you wouldn't be as good as if you had actually been really reflective and made each intubation count, which I've actually, had the pleasure of working with many anesthesia residents. And when they do that, they are superstars. But the beauty of anesthesia residencies, even if you didn't do those things, you still come out competent. And you learn a variety of techniques, and you get very, very good at them just by showing up. And that's the difference between anesthesia and specialties like EM and critical care. Is if you play their game, by which I mean you do not make every intubation count, you learn a variety of techniques, and you just kind of half-ass it, you will not turn out competent, even though the anesthesia folks will. Because just by sheer volume, they will get good regardless of how much energy they put into the actual learning. And again, just to stave off the friggin' jackasses on Twitter, I'm not saying anesthesia residents don't do that real contemplative learning approach. I'm saying even if they didn't, they would still turn out competent. So that's the game, just for those jokers who are trying to misunderstand deliberately. So if you play the game that the anesthesia residents could play, you will lose. They will win, you will lose. And that game is, let's give you an analogy. I'm told by the education wonks that people actually like stories and analogies. My brain doesn't work that way, but this is what I'm told I should do. So, you decide that you want to have a competition with Michael Jordan. I'm told by people that know sports, he's actually a pretty good basketball player. And if you decide to do this, and you play one-on-one, I promise you, you will lose. But if, on the other hand, you just, for 3 years of your life, have been practicing for, day in, day out, for 3 years, one shot, you are on the left side of the hoop, and you are about 2 feet back and 2 feet over, and you just practice that one shot for 3 years. And now you go one-on-one with Michael Jordan just in a, to 20 competition on that one shot, well, chances are you'll still lose. But at least you have a fighting chance. And if you play most of the other pros in the NBA at that one shot competition to 20, you have an excellent chance of being as good or better than that pro-level NBA player. For the non-Americans, that's the National Basketball Association. I only know that because I had to Google it, because I know shit about sports. But there you go. There's your analogy. If you play the game of all of basketball, I promise you, you will lose. But one-shot mastery, you practiced it for 3 years, you've really been deliberate about that one shot, and that's the thing that you've become an expert at. Wow. You have a fighting chance of being as good or better. So that's the game. Hopefully that makes sense. I live with an anesthesiologist. By rights, if I played her game, just all these different techniques all over, trying something new every time, varied, I should just call her for intubation that I have to get done. That would be unfair to my patients to not call this woman right here. But I don't have to do that because I am not playing the same game. I play a very different game. I have mastered now just one technique. That's all I've done for the past 12 years of my airway management career. I didn't do it in residency because I had to do what they told me to do, but I've just been practicing one thing. And as a result, I feel it's very fair to my patients to not call the person that I spend my nights with for every intubation. Now, this is the other thing. The game itself is different. The game itself is different. We're playing a different game. And when I say we, just because I know people are just waiting to jump, I don't mean anesthesiologists versus EM or critical care. What I mean is elective theater cases versus resuscitationist cases, whether they're intubated by EM, critical care, or anesthesia. Doesn't matter. The game that's different is out of theater versus in theater elective. And yes, I know very sick patients come to the theater. Those patients are also a different game. So out of the theater environment is different, whether you're an anesthesiologist or an intensivist or an EM doc. Critically ill patients are different. So resuscitationists must be different in the game they play. Okay, so those are the two main messages that got the Twitter storm started. Let's get into the meat of this. Now, there are many parts of this lecture. You'll get them over the course of the next year as EMCrit podcasts. But the lecture I gave in Toronto was simply about the concept of first pass success. Now, this slide was tweeted out, and this was inexplicable to me, but people went fucking nuts about this slide, telling me that this is, criminal and how dare I say stuff like this and inflammatory and wrong. And I don't know what friggin' literature people are reading. I didn't think this would be controversial at all. Anyone who knows anything about airway management in critically ill patients should be like, yeah, of course. Now, I've changed the equal sign to the associated with symbol because I want to be accurate here. I thought the equal was just fine, but people are going nuts. So let's be clear. Second pass is associated with a marked increase of complications, and if you really parse through the studies together, with mortality. But I don't want to put an equal sign here, so there you go. Analogous, associated, all right? Don't go crazy. But the evidence for this is pretty clean, so I don't know where people were, getting their knickers in a bunch about this. This is the article that probably encompasses all of the articles that you want to take a look at. So I'm just going to put this one up because if you pull this one out, you'll find the references to everything else you need except for what I'm going to show you next. So this is in the anesthesia literature. This is Anesthesia and Analgesia 2015. First shot's the best shot. And what this article goes through is the literature demonstrating that if you don't get it on the first pass, there's an association with marked increase and bad complications. Now, our friend of the show and EMCrit blogger, Laura Duggan, she put out this abstract. I don't think this has come out in actual publication form, but demonstrated a 4-fold increase in severe complications when you went from 1 attempt to 2. And so this is not controversial. You should look at the literature before you start shitstorming on Twitter. Now, this is from Thomas Mort's data. He has done a lot of the work on critical care airway management, and he actually dichotomized between 2 or fewer versus 3 or more. And when you actually look at his literature, the increased complication rates were there between 1 and 2 as well. But this is just where he chose to make the cut point in his study. And you can see cardiac arrest rate went from, in the decimal points to 11%, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly. And it's not subtle. Okay. And now the difference in game is that this is not applicable to elective operating theater patients. Those patients are probably fine. 2-3 attempts, you just reoxygenate and they're fine. Critically ill patients are not the same. They're not the same. They have a marked increase in complications between attempt 1 and attempt 2. And then, oh, wow, between attempts 2 and 3, it really gets bad, as Mort's literature shows you. Okay, now, this was a further shitstorm. By your own logic, the attending attempts, sick, previous failed ×2 technique on a thus twice dead patient. Yes, because what I meant is every single time they get to the second attempt, they die. That was obviously the best interpretation of that slide is, yes, if you get to 2 attempts, they all die. That's been our experience. Every single patient in the second attempt dies. Good job. The OT, that's operating theater for the non-British folk, game you refer to may be different. We do, however, play the game all day long while someone lasers their wards. I assume that's a new neologism for vocal cords. Cuts out a lung, a baby asphyxiates in their abdomen, etc. Great. Fantastic. Thanks for that tweet, my friend. Now, what it comes down to is what my friend Bill Hinckley calls -1A. This is your goal in the critically ill airway management, -1A. And what that is definitive airway sans, or if you want to screw the French, sine, because I like Latin, hypoxemia, hemodynamic collapse, and hypoventilation on the first attempt. And that's the key, is you want first pass success, but you want to get first pass success without getting the 3 deadly hop killers of hypoxemia, hemodynamic compromise, and hypoventilation. So there you go. And definitive airway, just for you vortexers out there, definitive airway is an endotracheal tube. And then a metastable airway would be a supraglottic in the critically ill patient. Okay, when I was a resident, I learned Mack and Miller, and then at the very tail end, we got a GlidEscope. No, it's not pronounced that way. It's a GlidEscope. And so I was, different technique for every patient, learn this, learn that. Oh, let's try something new. And that sounded great for me as a resident because I want to learn everything. That is the game of anesthesiologists who will get enough attempts at each individual technique to master them all. You will not be able to do that in emergency medicine or critical care. So, you will not be competent if you're switching things up every time. This is maybe controversial, but I don't think so. I'm going to say something else. Single technique mastery. Master one technique and then do it for every single intubation so that your learning curve will actually get you to the level of competency as quickly as possible. And then the second part of this is escalate early. If there is a technique that makes things better, that normally the airway algorithms will have you doing later on, but they bring nothing negative to the table, then just do them on the first attempt and make your first attempt your best attempt. Now, this is my extrapolation of the literature out there on the learning curve for intubation. Now, you got to understand, this was taken from literature where people, primarily anesthesia registrars, were doing all different techniques. So it might be even a lower number if you're going for single technique mastery. The other thing to understand from this extrapolation, and obviously this is not to scale and I can't draw, and I'm sorry, but I will explain my concept of this graph and then maybe one of you will construct a nicer one, is that they weren't using video laryngoscopy. Now, why does that matter? It's not because video laryngoscopy will make your attempts better. It might, I think it does, but that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is if their learning was on direct, then it's a very difficult way to teach because you have no idea what they did wrong. So they have to learn on their own without coaching because they get in there and it's like, what do you see? I don't see anything. Okay, well, I've moved a little. I don't quite know what I did. It made it better. So great, now I got it. Oh, good. But on the other hand, if you're learning with video laryngoscopy, I could tell you, you just overran your epiglottis, jackass, pull back. I don't say that. I'm a very nice teacher, as my residents will attest. And so therefore, they actually learn within the same intubation. They don't fail, learn, fail, never really quite knowing what they're doing. I would argue this learning curve is very different with video laryngoscopy because a good coach could actually train you for each intubation to maximize each pass in terms of learning. Now, it seems like somewhere around the 57 mark is where you markedly jump up. And what you get is you get a portion of this curve where for the first few, in my mind, you're not that great in terms of your mastery level. And then all of a sudden you get to the steep part of the learning curve where each intubation sends you much higher up that mastery spike. And then by the time you get up here, which in my mind is around 100 tubes, it might be a little less, yeah, you keep getting incrementally better, but you're talking about the difference of small numbers in the percentage of mastery, which is an arbitrary unit base, but you get the idea, I think. And most things that are out there that you can learn are kind of like this. You start off slow, you get this rapid learning spike of the steep portion of the curve, and then you kind of level off. And what you want to do is maximize what gets you onto the steep portion and keeps you there for as long as possible. And for me, that means single technique mastery and escalation early and video laryngoscopy for learning, not even necessarily for intubation success, but for learning success. And I will put a link in the show notes to openairway.org or .com that has a review of all this literature, and you can see where I've mentally extrapolated this from. Okay, so what we're trying to do is maximize learning and then maximize the reflection. So it's not enough for me to just be able to coach you, but you should go home and think about it and visually picture what you did right, what you did wrong to lock in the muscle memory. That's how it works. If your brain visualizes, you're activating the same areas of the brain that actual doing it would do. So each intubation should be proceeded with visualization, and you should go home and think about what you did right or what you did wrong, and then you will maximize your learning. And this is why I think that if you could get to 100 with the way I'm doing, I think you'll be pretty damn good. And much to the chagrin of my nasty anesthesia colleagues, and I'll be very specific here, I'm not saying anesthesiologists are nasty, I'm saying there are nasty anesthesiologists, and almost all of them are on Twitter, is you are playing your nasty comments to me as if that you will continue for the rest of your career, just keep getting much better at airway management, and therefore, EM and critical care, and this, at least the nasty UK anesthesiologist, should never be intubating. It just shouldn't happen. And that's not actually how it works. There's a point where you level off, or at least that's my opinion, and I'm happy to go head to head to prove that there is a leveling off period in the learning curve. And once that occurs, it doesn't really matter as long as there's not a degradation of skills that you've done more. Or at least this is what I tell my wife when we argue at dinner. Okay, so here we go. This was all intro to what you actually were promised, which is the EMCrit Remix 2.0 of the shock trauma failed airway algorithm. Now, to my understanding, this is the only airway algorithm, the shock trauma that is, not the EMCrit Remix, that has actually been studied. Not studied well, not prospectively, not the way you'd want it, but at least studied in retrospective fashion. Now, if you have your airway algorithm that's been studied, let me know, because I'm super curious to see them, because as far as I know, the ASA, the DAS, all of those airway societies haven't studied the actual patient results of their airway algorithms. The shock trauma one has been studied, which is good in my mind. And so, I had the original remix. This is 2.0, and I'm going to go through it step by step. Okay, so this is a patient you've already decided to go RSI. Now, in the intubation checklist, there's all the ideas of who you shouldn't RSI, and maybe you should be awake intubating. But let's assume you've already decided to go with the RSI. Okay, so laryngoscopy attempt number 1 is going to be a standard geometry. That means it kind of looks like a Macintosh. There was a lot of confusion on Twitter about this, but these are industry standard terms. You can no longer say CMAC versus GlidEscope because the CMAC makes both and GlidEscope makes both standard geometry and hyperangulated geometry blades. So SG means standard geometry. It looks like a Macintosh. You could use it as both a direct device or a video device, and a Bougie. Whoa, what's going on here? You're asking for a Bougie on the first pass attempt? You're asking for video on every attempt? Fuck yes, I am. Get over it. Now, why video laryngoscopy on the first attempt? Well, a couple reasons. One, if you need to fail, you could fail within the same airway attempt from a direct visualization to a video visualization just by looking up at the screen. If you're looking at the video and the airway gets soiled, the camera gets all blotted out, you could just look in the mouth and do direct on the same attempt. You don't need to fail and change devices. The other stuff has already been mentioned. Every intubation on a learner should be done with video so that your coach, your attending, your staff could actually tell you what you did wrong in real time so you can improve. And if you're a already staff or attending, you should use a video even if you're not going to look, because you could record the intubation and then go back afterwards and figure out how you effed it up if you did, or what you did wonderfully if you got it right. And so that's powerful. Now, I'm going to go a step further and say that unless airway schmoo ruins your visualization, you should just use the video as a learner. Now, why? Don't you need to learn direct? Well, it's my argument that if you went to CT scan and you've done 30 intubations as a learner and you went to CT scan and there was no video there, and now you had to use the direct out of that code card, and you've only done 30 intubations with the video looking at the screen, you've never looked in the mouth, that you would be better at an intubation with a direct laryngoscope looking in the mouth than someone who's done those 30 intubations with a direct laryngoscope. This is my argument. It's the argument of folks like Ruben Strayer, frenemy to the show. It's the argument of other people who I think are really smart teaching airway. And I think it's true that if you had never done a direct, you'd be better at direct than someone who's done only direct, because the video makes you that much better as a learner. It teaches the anatomy better. It gives you a better field of view. It identifies structures better. You get better coaching, and I think you'd be better. If you don't believe me, try it out. Someone should study this. I mean, it'd probably be a mannequin study, which is garbage, but it would be better than nothing, and I think you'd prove me right. that if after 30 intubations with video versus 30 intubations with direct, you gave the person on their 31st a direct with that mannequin and asked them to intubate, they would do a better job. Okay, the second part of this is Bougie First. Now, I've talked about this in a previous show. I'm not going to belabor it too much, but the driver study out of Hennepin, published in the JAMA. Holy shit. Airway literature in JAMA. Pretty cool. Good job, dude. Demonstrated increased first pass success. This has been my experience. But the only way you get that is if you're good at it. The only way you get good at it is by doing it as your single technique mastery. Do it every time. Video and Bougie. Standard geometry, you'll get damn good at it. You'll get good at it like the Hennepin folks will, and then you'll increase your first pass success. Now, this study is in the anesthesia literature, just published. This is the highest first pass success rate I've seen in the literature, 98.2. Holy crap! And these are EMS physicians doing it, so it's not easy intubations. CMAC, standard geometry, plus a Frova Bougie. Bam! Look at that number. That's what you could get by single technique mastery with early escalation. All right, you got to practice. You're not going to be good if you've never done a Bougie intubation. For the first time, you decide CMAC plus Bougie. That's why I think this is a dumb way to fail. You don't want to fail to something you're not good at. You want to just do it at the very beginning so you get good at it. Okay, laryngoscopy number 2 is you either, based on the video results of what you saw in intubation number 1, if there's a correctable cause that you could identify, like you grabbed a MAC 3, but it turns out the patient is bigger than you thought and you need a MAC 4, then okay, you could go with that again. On the other hand, if you've done perfect maximization of visualization on attempt number 1 with a standard geometry video laryngoscope, you've done external laryngeal manipulation, additional head lifting, additional lifting with a partner if the problem was you couldn't get the head off the bed, and you were not able to get a good view, then on intubation number 2, you want to switch over to a hyperangulated blade. Hyperangulated VL is not a great first pass technique in my opinion, and in the opinion of people smarter than me. But where it really shines is where you've optimized and still can't get a great view of at least the posterior glottic structures in order to be able to slam a Bougie in there. So you'll switch over to either optimization or hyperangulated VL. Now, the problem with hyperangulated VL is it's asking for a different technique, which is that of a stylet, a hyperangulated stylet. I don't like that. I don't like you having to switch over. Now, on the first part, the technique of standard geometry and hyperangulated video laryngoscopy are almost identical to the point where if you master video standard geometry and did the same thing with the actual laryngoscope of a hyperangulated blade, you'll be just fine. By which I mean, for both standard geometry and hyperangulated geometry, the key is to get a crappy view, to get chords or posterior notch in the top half, or maybe even the top third of the screen, in which case you'll have no problem advancing. If you do that with both a standard and a hyperangulated laryngoscope, you will be in great shape. So the only way to screw up these video devices is to put the entire glottis filling up the screen. It means you're too close, you won't be able to intubate. But what is different is now you're back to using a stylet, and a different stylet than you trained on, and that's not good. We want single technique mastery. And the way to do that is with a malleable Bougie. SunMed makes one. You could bend it in the exact same shape of the stylets, the GlidEscope stylet or the CMAC stylet, and just use a Bougie, which means you're doing the same technique for the second part of it as you did on laryngoscopy number 1, which is delightful. VBM makes one as well. Rich Levitan is producing one. And on both of them, all three, as far as I know, you could bend them to the shape you want and then be able to use them to a hyperangulated blade. All right. Laryngoscopy number 3 should be attending only. It doesn't mean laryngoscopy number 1 or 2 couldn't be attending only. It doesn't mean that you'll actually get to laryngoscopy number 3. If this is a super sick patient, then maybe you're only going to do 2 attempts at laryngoscopy. This is not forcing you to do 3. It's telling you can never do more than 3. And this is key. And on some intubations, attending is going to do laryngoscopy number 1. Now, the only helpful tweet I got in the entire Twitter shitstorm. Okay, I'll go to the tweet and I'll come back. Okay, so if the goal is first pass success, why not start at number 3? And this was a trainee, so he's actually hurting himself by asking this question, but it is a good question. It's a question I wrestle with, and sometimes you will. start with the attending first, as I mentioned. But what are the ethics of letting our trainees do these first passes when we know the attending could probably do a better job? And then it balances with, if the attendings did every intubation, then the residents would never learn and there'd be no new attendings. And so how do I wrestle with this? Well, there are intubations I will just take over at the beginning, but they're very, very few because I use video on every intubation. And therefore, even though my resident is holding the laryngoscope, I could fix almost everything they are failing at if the patient needs to be intubated now, which either means I put my hand over their hand on the handle and lift harder, or get a better view, or pull back a little on the laryngoscope. Or if the problem is that they're not properly advancing the bougie, I'll just let them continue holding the laryngoscope and I'll advance the bougie. So really, in essence, when it needs to be, the attending is intubated on the first one, regardless of what's going on. Hopefully that answers this only legitimate question I got in this whole Twitter shitstorm. But in order for all this to work, the attendings must be the best in the room, which means if you are not good at intubations, don't supervise them. Get one of your colleagues to do it, or take a course. You can go to Rich Levitan's course in Baltimore and intubate countless times, more probably than you've ever done in your actual residency, in one fell swoop, all different airways. The cadaver fidelity is quite good. You'll learn all the different techniques, but don't. Just keep doing standard geometry video and hyperangulated video and bougie, and you will really up your game a lot. If you need to go with our colleagues in the operating theater or in the ORs, do that. Just do whatever it takes to be the best in the room. Now, one other tip I will say is after each intubation by your residents, you should put the laryngoscope back in gently and use that to pass the NG tube. I think this is a much safer, gentler, less traumatic way to place NG tubes, and it will give you a second laryngoscopy to allow your skills to get there. Now, if they got in there, you were watching on video and it was the easiest intubation in the world, then don't even bother putting the laryngoscope in. But if your resident had a hard time and just barely got the bougie in, only seeing posterior notch, then go in there with the laryngoscope again. It's even harder because the tube's in your way, and get your view of what they saw, and then use it to place the NG tube. And this will be another way to keep your skills up. Okay. If you fail 3 attempts, you don't get another one. There's no 4th attempt at laryngoscopy until something has changed and the situation has been reconciled. And so what happens now is you place a supraglottic airway. And just to get rid of the top here, if in any of these 3 you got success as marked by end tidal CO2, then you confirm and you're happy. If at any point during those attempts, when you failed, the SAT dropped to 93%, you don't start your next attempt until you BVM with an oropharyngeal airway, or if you're worried or you're not getting end tidal CO2 with that BVM, then you switch over to supraglottic right away. So in anywhere in here, if their SAT drops, you will get their SAT up. And if it's not happening with the BVM, if that's not generating end tidal CO2 after a breath or two, then you put in a supraglottic airway. And if that fails, well, now you are in failure mode. You go to surgical airway. So let's make that very clear. The other nice thing here is before you place the or simultaneous with placing the supraglottic, there should always be a second attending in the room, ED or critical care, and you should consider calling for help. Because there's no reason not to. Now, are you calling for help for anesthesia to come and rescue this airway? No, you're calling for help because if you manage now to get a supraglottic airway in, it's really nice to have a whole bunch of different colleagues in the room to think about what to do next. Because before anesthesia arrives, if that supraglottic airway is not getting you end tidal with the first few breaths, you progress to surgical airway. But if you do place a supraglottic airway and you're getting good end tidal and the SATs come up, well, now what should happen is you should de-adrenalize the room. Everyone should take a deep breath. You should re-oxygenate. You should denitrogenate the patient and then decide what you want to do. And after that 3 minutes of denitrogenation, everyone's pulse rate has reobtained normalcy and you got a bunch of colleagues in the room. Then you could decide, maybe we intubate through the supraglottic. Maybe we decide that we're going to remove that supraglottic and take one more attempt at intubation. Or maybe we decide to do a supraglottic, perfectly oxygenated trach or crike. We have a lot of options, but those options should only be thought through once the adrenaline dump has occurred and you could actually have a cognizant thought. Okay? Now, if on the other hand the supraglottic fails, you go to surgical airway. The supraglottics I recommend for most places, don't get me wrong, I love my AirQ. Those are gorgeous by Cook Gas. I take no money from anyone, anytime, anywhere. But those were great. But they're really an expert level device, I think. But the idiot-proof device, until they create some better until they create some better idiots, so we'll call it idiot-resistant, is the iGel. No cuff. It really it handles ham-fisted jammery very well. In fact, the way you fail on these devices is by not pushing them in enough. So, the ham-fisted jammery really works nicely on these. And the size 4, which is what's pictured here, works from 50 to 90 kilos. And remember, a morbidly obese patient still has the airway of a 70-kilo patient. So this is really the full breadth of adult EM, unless they're basketball players or little people. So this is why I really like this device a lot. But to use this device or a BVM at any point in this failed airway algorithm, there must be waveform end tidal CO2. You cannot go by chest rise. You cannot watch the pulse ox hoping that'll tell you. You must use end tidal CO2, or else you just shouldn't be in the airway game. Anyone who doesn't have waveform end tidal probably should tell their hospital we're below the standard of care. This is not acceptable. Okay, and we've already talked about that if there's a failure of any point to keep the sats good, or the supraglottic fails when the sats get bad, surgical airway, cut to cure. Love it. So, if you haven't heard about the EMCrit Crike lectures, you can find them at emcrit.org.crike. Okay, so to bring it all home, you do suck at airway if you're not really adapting to the critical care resuscitation environment, and if you're not an anesthesiologist, if you're using multiple techniques. So master one technique, escalate on the first try. Our patients deserve the best care. If you're going to do, this time I'll do this, this time do that, then don't bother. Just call anesthesia to do your intubations. But if you're going to accept that your world in critical care, EM, airway management, is a little bit different because you're not going to get as many opportunities to practice, then your patients can get the best care with you if you do what I say. Single technique mastery, escalate early. All right, so be the best, no matter what specialty you're in. You're a resuscitationist, and that's what we do. We give the best care to our sick patients. That's all I got. I'm sure there'll still be comments. Hopefully they won't be dumb comments like I got on Twitter. So put them in the show notes, and I will talk to you soon. And of course, the Airway algorithm will be in the show notes as well. Scott Weingart, EMCrit Podcast, saying bye-bye.